And we are recording this event, so please be aware of that, should you wish to let that affect what you want to say, because it will become a public resource. And you will see that we have now, thanks to Gabriel and Shika, we have all our previous discussions are online, and we are getting some really nice comments on how useful they are for people who happen to be teaching the texts in their class. So they're sending their students to look at past events. So welcome. By now, everybody knows that I'm Shireen Hassim, the convener of this seminar program. This is the last one for the semester, and in fact, the last one until fall next year. So thank you all who have been coming every week during the term. I want to acknowledge today that we are gathering and speaking from Carleton University, which is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I'm particularly mindful of that because we're talking about Christianity and the relationships between Christian missionaries and Indigenous South Africans. And I want to acknowledge that in Canada, we do have this dark history of the implication of the Catholic Church in the residential school system, which was very much part of the colonial civilizing mission. So just want to acknowledge that as we have this conversation about Christianity in a different context, and perhaps one of those areas where we don't share the same experiences. So a reminder just of the role of the Catholic Church here. I also, because it's December 6th today, want to note that in Canada we are we're commemorating the December 6, 1989 massacre of women at the École Polytechnique in Montreal, in which 14 women were killed, murdered. 14 others were seriously injured in an overt attack on feminism and feminists. So today's is the White Ribbon Day, and all around our city and other cities, there is a vigil being held in the middle of our seminar, unfortunately, but I wanted to note that. And then finally, because this is the last get together for this year, I want to thank Shika Kujau and Gabriel Habiremye, who is, they're lurking there, they can wave, who have been so wonderful organizing the logistics of the seminar for the term. So thank you to them. So we are talking about Christianity, gender, and tradition in early 20th century South Africa. And I'm so pleased to welcome my old friend, Natasha Erlank, Professor of History from the University of Johannesburg, also a professor affiliated to Carleton University's History Department. So this is in part a familiar territory for you, Natasha. Natasha's worked for a very long time on these issues of marriage, sexuality, and gender, and published a number of articles, including some wonderful work on masculinity in the ANC, which sort of was a weird little detour from this work, but not unconnected, as you will see in this book, in which she takes us through a really amazing history of the complex relationships between Christianity and other forms of meaning-making in early 20th century South Africa, to show us how much of that interaction was open-ended and was less was not always as impositional as it does at times appear. So we get this wonderful picture of these syncretic relationships. Natasha talks about the ways in which the church became a fulcrum for imagining and creating new forms of sociality, which she hinges on this concept of intimacy. That it was a way of constituting as well, a kind of convening a public sphere. She takes us through the rituals of marriage and the relationship between white weddings and customary weddings, something that is now such a commonplace part of our lives in South Africa, right? That we're so accustomed to having the customary wedding as well as the white wedding. So I found this utterly fascinating in the book. We're really fortunate to find as an interlocutor for Wendy, Urban-Mead, to make herself available for this. Thank you so much, Wendy. I couldn't think of anyone better. Perhaps Debbie Gateskill, I might have included you. Wendy is an associate professor of history in the Master of Arts in Teaching program at Bard College in upstate New York. So welcome, Wendy. She's the author of a book with very similar concerns: Gender and Piety, Faith, Family, and Colonial Rule in Matabeleland, Zimbabwe, which is also an Ohio Press title. So shout out to Ohio Press for doing some good work. So welcome, both of you. As usual, we'll begin with the author just presenting us with some of the key arguments in the book, and then Wendy will respond as she wishes to those arguments, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So Natasha, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending in whichever time zone you are. And I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that it's the end of a long year. It may not be the end of the academic year in the north, but you know, it has been a long year, and I think everyone is gearing down. So it's really lovely to see you all, lovely to see some new faces, lovely to see the familiar faces. And thanks to Shireen and to Carlton for inviting me. It's, you know, I've been an associate at Carlton for quite some years now, and I like the way in which there are many similarities between the university where I currently am, the University of Johannesburg, and Carlton. And I think that we have similar, thanks, Belinda, similar kinds of understanding. So in the little brief that I got for the talk this evening, one of the things that I was asked to do was to talk a bit about the genesis of the book, which is obviously a very apt comment. And the genesis is long, took much more than kind of, 6 days. And I thought I would reflect back on two things, because the book brings together two rather rocky and thorny questions in the South African Historical Academy. For many years, as a younger scholar, a young historian, I used to stand up at seminars and say, but what about gender? Have you considered how this affects what you are saying if you consider the gendered implications of what you are writing about? And I would sit down again, as a presenter after a presenter did not pay me any attention, and some did, to be fair. And after a while, I think I just got tired of that, and I thought, well, let me try something new. And I started saying, what about Christianity? This is just a way of trying to say that I've been concerned with some of the issues in this book for many, many years. I haven't always found a way, or it took me a while to find a way to bring them together. And Shireen talked about little sidelines. I've done a couple of other things as well. But I kept coming back to this particular issue and trying to work out, when I say this particular issue, I'll explain in a moment, what it was that I was actually trying to write about in the book, and a shout out to some of my colleagues in the audience tonight for helping me choose the color. And I'm pleased to say one of the things about Ohio is they let you decide about cover design, which is not something that every publisher allows you to do. So there are three things that I want to mention, three things that feature in the book, and I was trying to decide whether to talk about them as sets of inquiry, as issues. They're not quite theoretical concepts. They're perhaps arenas of study. And the first is obviously Christianity. And what I was interested in doing after many years of reading, first largely letters written by European missionaries in South Africa, documents from the 19th century, later working into reading material written by African Christians in the 20th century, was how to understand the place of Christianity in everyday life, not just as an intellectual concept, not just as something that's about or only about spirituality, but that helps to determine the choices people make in their lives. So I was interested in how to think about the consequences of a self-confessed Christianity for public and private life in South Africa. And I say self-confessed because if you look at the various censuses that have been taken in South Africa over the last 20 years, if you look at some of the historical census data, it is clear that large numbers of South Africans at the moment, probably in the region of 86% to 90% of those who are enumerated, say self-identify as Christian. Now, one of the questions to then say is, well, what does this mean? So that's partly what the book is trying to tackle, is what does it mean to actually be Christian in the early 20th century? And one of the things that I will say here is that it's not always about spirituality. It's about a range of positionalities. There's a whole set of theology, and some of the people on this Zoom tonight have written about these issues very powerfully. There's a whole set of theology that, in fact, is no longer so concerned about belief in relation to Christianity, for instance. So I want to sort of bracket, there's a conversation we could have about theology and what it means to be Christian, but I think that's a kind of maybe a bit of a red herring for tonight. Tonight where I am, today where you are. So the early literature, the early historical literature, a lot of the literature looking at missions in South Africa, kind of got caught up on understanding Christianity as something that was only happened in relation to material benefit for converts. And this really distorts the picture. It's not what Christianity meant to people. And I also want to say that one needs to look very carefully at how Christianity shifts as a set of meaning for people's lives from the 19th into the early 20th century. It shifts again in probably the 1950s, and more recently it's shifted again. So, it's a set of moving idioms, ideals, and figurative and literal positions. So that's the one thing. How does it fit into the history of South Africa? But I wasn't going to write a book about the impact of Christianity in South Africa for a number of reasons, principally because if you do that, you have to write about the liberation struggle, and that wasn't quite where I was going with this book. Then there's another thing that I wanted to think about, which was what kinds of transformations in gender relations are consequent upon the adoption of Christianity in South Africa. And when I say consequent upon, I'm trying to use that phrase to indicate that not all of these things are strictly causal, but that that certain practices and strategies for daily living, ideas about marriage, about heterosexuality, about morality, are deeply bound up with how people understand themselves to be Christians. And another point in relation to this, in particular, which leads to the title of the book, is that we need to broaden out, and I really do think what we understand by intimacy. So conventionally, many people would understand intimacy to be about the relationships that happen between people, largely sexual, but not always sexual, the relationships that happen between people in private. But I think we need to be cognizant that all intimate relationships can only be formed in relation to people's public selves, and that most intimate relationships, by far and away the bulk of them, certainly in South Africa, are always mediated between what is happening in the so-called private and what is happening in the so-called public. And in the book, I talk a bit about how to think through these terms, public and private, in the context of South Africa, because they do not map onto Western understandings of private and public. So, there are a number of theorists who have written about what's often called public intimacy. You'll know some of their names, and these are the kinds of ideas that need to be pulled into our thinking about Black intimate relationships in South Africa. Oh, the other thing I should say is that the scope of the book are those people who consider themselves to be married by lobola, by bride wealth, or who aspire to be married by lobola, which is, I think, both accurate, but also a way to try and talk through the fuzzy racial lines that exist in South Africa, particularly between, for instance, notions of so-called coloredness and what it means to be African. And just on that note, a shout out to a really lovely book that I received in the post 2 days ago. It's Tsepo Masango Cherry's Kingdom Come, which is really interesting on the intersection of those kinds of racial politics. Okay, so that's the kind of subject matter of the book. And then I was interested in how the culture, the moral culture of 19th century Christianity met, intersected with, interacted with, and was infused by traditional ideas about marriage, which is why large portions of the book, most of the book, are about things like bride wealth, what we call in South Africa, lobola or bohadi, this kind of weird idea about polygamy, what happens when weddings start to shift. It's about how people get married. There's quite a lot of sex in there. And so those are some of the things that I was trying to write about. And this is what I've been saying to you is a kind of framing for some of the discussion here. Then I wanted to take all of these concepts and show how they become widely accepted, widely understood, widely shared in public life. Because it's one thing to understand that ideas about sexuality have shifted, usually in a direction that places moral blame on women, that stigmatizes non-normative sexualities. But it's one thing to establish that those ideas exist, and it's another thing to show how those ideas come to be shared. And that's where I look at the convening that forms part of the title. I try to think about how it is that things like the church and the institutional structures of the church, which were vast and constituted a web that spread across large parts of Southern Africa, not just South Africa, obviously. And then just to sort of belabor the metaphor even further, even if you weren't caught up in, even if you weren't part of that web or you didn't help to create it, you might be caught in the stickiness of the web. So part of the argument of the book is that the moral universe of Christianity pulls large number of people into its influence, even people who are not themselves Christian, because they are spending a lot of time having to debate why they are still traditional, in opposition to people who say, I am Christian, for instance. So that's some of the framing of the book. And the book then tracks through a number of chapters that look at the way in which key practices help to show how Christianity is affecting gender and intimate relations. One of the early chapters has to do with traditional male circumcision and the way in which masculinity in particular is predicated on the idea that to be a good man, you need to be a good member of the nation. And the shorthand here is that it doesn't, ideas about masculinity in the racially contested environment of early 20th century South Africa don't say men ought to be good husbands. They say that men need to be proud Zulus or proud Xhosa men, or they need to be good Setswana speakers, because this is the arena, and they need to do this in public. This is the arena in which they are going to contest African nationalist politics, for instance. Okay, so that's a brief summary. And then I'm going to look at ideas about sex and shame, and the way in which Christianity completely reconfigures ideas about Christianity, particularly the kind of moral universe of Christianity, reconfigure what's considered to be moral and immoral, with the burden falling disproportionately on African women. And there's a very poignant case in the book, if any of you have had a chance to look at it. I'll further go on to look in more detail at the politics of Lobola. There's a chapter on marriage that tracks the way in which for Africans for whom forms of marriage are recorded in the early 20th century, the most common way for Africans to marry is through the church. These are not necessarily people who would be ardent believers, which is not to say that they aren't, but there are a whole range of reasons, including belief, that account for why people choose to marry in church. This slips off to a large extent after the 1950s, but what happens after the 1950s is marriage rates overall drop, not just Christian marriage rates. Then there's a chapter on looking at the white wedding, which examines some of the effective politics of how people get married. And it's all part of a larger discussion that I want to have, or that I'm trying to have, about the practice whereby South Africans, Black South Africans today, will say they have two weddings. They have the traditional one and they have the Christian one. And they have outfits for each, different locations sometimes for each. And my argument would actually be these are the same thing, that, you know, marriage is so transformed, although the language around it hasn't, that in most cases, people who are contracting traditional marriages, you will find they've also contracted a so-called white wedding. Now, the white wedding is, you know, we can have a lot of discussion about that. And what does it mean if I say that white weddings are an aspect of church life? Then there is a chapter, the final chapter has to do with something, and the motivation for it had a lot to do with me getting really cross with commentators who talked about the instability of African intimate life, which I always found in the literature to be vastly patronizing and also inattentive to the shape that people's married lives were actually taking. So if you read a range of sources from the 1930s onwards, people talk about how horrible it is that women are having successive partners. But when you actually look at the detail, you're looking at relationships that are lasting for 6 years, then someone dies, then a person is trying to contract another relationship, but they're not allowed to because they don't have the proper papers. I look at some of Mampela Rampele's work around hostel dwellers in Cape Town to show that, in fact, some relationships, despite the odds, are actually relatively long-lived. So this perception of declining marriage rates in the later 20th century as equivalent to less effective relationships is not quite accurate. And I think that's important to say. So you know, in the book, one of the tensions for me in writing it, and this is perhaps a methodological point, and then I'm going to stop for some discussion, is that there was a fair amount of depressing material. It can be quite tragic to read about people's failed relationships, but at the same time, I think that there's a lot of South African historiography that wants us to look at failed relationships, because this rhetoric has been said, certainly by discussions about migrant labor, for instance, which very seldom talk about happy migrant labor relationships, for example. And so we are predisposed, certainly within this part of the world, to think about the ravages wrought upon family life by apartheid, which is true, but it is equally true that people find creative ways to remain in relationships, to hang on to some kind of stability, to manage their relationships in ways that are beneficial to them. And while Christianity is a source of great moral distress for many people because of the strictures it places on sexual behavior, it is also a great source of comfort to people because the church is a stable point in people's lives that argues that stable and companionate relationships are actually a good thing. Last 2 points. I should have entered the book in 1994. I couldn't, obviously, for reasons of space, but one of the things that I find when I've talked about the book is people always have questions for what happens after 1950, because there are big changes. And, maybe we'll get a bit of time to talk about this afterwards. And the post-1950 decades really contrast sharply with the pre-1950 decades. The other point that I wanted to make is that I think if I were to do a sort of coda to the book right now, something that I've been thinking about quite a lot this last year is I'd like to look into the world of female friendships as a form of sociality in Southern African history, because I think a lot of the resources that were absent to people in their intimate sexual lives were present in the kinds of friendships and relationships that women especially would have had with other women. And I'll just leave it there for the moment. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Wendy.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join the conversation, Shireen, and thank you, Natasha, for your book, which I've enjoyed pieces of along the way for years as different pieces of your thinking have been presented in various places and ways. And it's really rewarding to see it all come into the single volume. Your book is like a great ingathering or a convening of many strands of historical conversation. Convening Black Intimacy is its own scholarly thickness of reflection on questions about Black South African social history. As I was reading, I just kept thinking about thickness. You were talking about thickness, and I'm like, yes, this is thick in a good way. You're absorbing and in conversation with so much of the foregoing historical literature. And as you survey it and take it in, you're also critiquing some things which you just mentioned, the underappreciation for Christianity's place in South Africa's broader institutional as well as gendered social history. I really, of course, can relate to that. And I loved your 2 questions, but what about gender? But what about Christianity? Because those 2 things are everywhere if you start walking around and looking at people. So I'm glad that this is, at the foreground. We see that you've really captured and mobilized histories of Christianity, literacy, legal history, the regional studies of political and social change in the Eastern Cape in particular, intellectual history of figures such as the Sogas, gendered histories of all kinds, and then the transnational winging of this material is particularly relative to literacy and Protestant networks that now are not only webbing out all over South Africa, but into other parts of the world as well. And your book is showing us how these literatures are reflecting elements of life that are all connected with each other, even when some studies might set up their discussion in ways that would let you think that they're not all connected, particularly the thickness of the Christian milieu in so many things that don't look like they're necessarily Christian from the way they're looked at from the surface, if you will. But your book is not a denominational history. It's not an institutional history of a church. It's not a story about missionaries. It's not a story about exemplary African converts. And yet all of these are also hovering in the midst of this, but in a kind of, yes, that's our starting point. Now let's see what happened in people's real lives because these mission stations were put here. And you're making that point that the Eastern Cape was one of the areas most thickly occupied by mission stations in the British Empire. And by the later 19th century is taken as a kind of unexcavated starting point for looking at then how do the literacies and moralities and conciliar and democratic dispositions of Protestant Christian world permeate the lives of Africans. So I'm just kind of telling you what I saw, what you were doing. I have a whole bunch of questions. Some of them are big questions on the meta level, and some of them are littler questions. Shireen, are we supposed to be done by 2? Sorry, unmute there.
2:20.
Okay,
Sorry,
2:20.
while we have this pause, Stephen, did you mean to have your hand up?
It's me, who's decidedly not Stephen, unfortunately, sharing a computer. And yes, I do mean to have my hand up, but I'm happy for Wendy to keep going.
Oh, okay.
She's in the queue for her next.
Oh, you're early in the queue. I
She's
see.
early in the queue, yeah.
Okay, well,
Listen, I have a bad short-term memory. I'm
sorry.
just keeping it up so I remember I raised my hand.
sorry, Wendy.
It's all good. No,
continue.
that's lovely. It's fine. So I think Natasha, I think I don't want to throw all the questions at once at you unless you want to hear them all and then you take the ones you like. And if other people like them, they can reiterate them. Shireen, what's your suggestion?
Yeah, Shireen, you.
I feel like you should finish your whatever you want to say, Wendy, and
Okay.
then what we'll do then is open it up for questions, but yours come first.
Thank you.
And then as anxious as others may be to get into the conversation, they'll just have to be patient. So no, you go ahead with your questions first.
Okay, thank you. One of my larger scale questions is, who out there is most challenged by what this work has to offer? You said on page 75, for example, an anthropologist study might say that sex happened without love, and that opened the question to me, like, who might be disrupted by what you're bringing to this conversation, which then tags into my next question is, I think you have some nuanced things to say about agency that are worth highlighting for their own. Agency, you remarked on as a kind of often just seen as like, oh, if you're a Christian and you're doing something, that means it's Christian agency. And you're like, well, that's not quite it. So and agency, of course, has been the big watchword of the conversation about Christians and Africans going back to the late 90s. And so I think that you're making some really interesting, nuanced things happen in that conversation that are worth bringing out. I noticed this is one of the smaller points, but it really struck me because I saw this in the research that I have been doing over the years. When you mentioned letters written by someone named XYZ in his letters to Talili about male initiation, and how he outed some other men by name who had not been initiated, and this contempt that XYZ had for customs and conventions of secrecy and respect. And I feel like that's a theme that I haven't really developed, but I certainly have seen it. And so that's one of my smaller questions. If you've got more to say about that, I think it's an interesting thing that's worth considering. Regarding Lobola and Christian versions of Lobola, it always makes me think about the relationship between Christian teaching and ancestors, and I feel like that's an area that could bear more attention. I just wanted to flag my appreciation for your looking for ways that people stay connected, to find ways to have their family, even if there is labor migration. Not to sugarcoat that at all, but people find their families a really important navigational point in their lives, and you made space for that in a way that I really appreciated. I wondered if you've taken any sort of subsets of this material to audiences in local venues in the Eastern Cape and church communities, whether you've done that and what kind of responses you might have gotten to some of this material. I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more on why, and you explained it, but I would love to have you kind of sit with it a little bit. The book is about South Africa, and your source base is very Eastern Cape, not only, but it's very heavily inflected by Eastern Cape material. And you explain why that Eastern Cape source base still warrants a South Africa header. And I think it would be good to express a little bit more about how that's happening. I'm teaching this course on history of transnational histories of boarding schools. And I just wondered whether Christianity in the boarding schools in South Africa, interesting bunch of convergences as well. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I read avidly your footnotes about Lovedale and other such things. And then finally, some contemporary resonance, which you mentioned in your remarks just now. Is life in South Africa that secular? I was just thinking also about how the newspaper letters of the 20s and 30s, interestingly, what's happening on spaces such as Twitter with conversations and debates about moral issues continuing in sort of political morality and sexual morality. And then I just wondered if you have any thoughts of your own on when you have this whole discussion about ukumecha sex. And one small comment not elaborated about how it was often coerced. Does that have anything to do with non-consensual sex over time and into the present? That is my wild potpourri of questions and comments. But I'll leave it there. So I want people to have time to also add.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Tash, do you want to have a go at those, and then we'll open it up?
I'll have a go at some of them. I should probably start with why this book is not about the Eastern Cape, but appears to be about the Eastern Cape. It started off as a book about the Eastern Cape because of previous work that I'd done. But I found that as I was actually writing, I don't know, somewhere about halfway through the process, and I think it may have had something to do with the fact that there was a large influx of people from KwaZulu-Natal into my department, and I spent several years also previously examining for KwaZulu-Natal. Now, for those of you who don't know, in South Africa, if you're looking at 19th century history, basically you're doing the Cape or Natal, and the two never meet, which is a real historiographical issue. I mean, there are two different places, there are two different British colonies. One could have an interesting reflection on that. And while I was looking at the material on KwaZulu-Natal, which I hadn't done before because I came from the Cape, I realized the kinds of similarities that existed between what was happening in KwaZulu-Natal, similarities but also differences. And then I started to look more broadly, and in particular when I was looking at the newspaper debates, I realized that the comments in the newspapers were coming from across the country, which led me to look more closely at a range of sources, particularly dealing with what would today be Tswana-speaking communities straddling the border between South Africa and Botswana, to look at some of the material Jackie Solway has written about this in Botswana, reading a lot of the anthropological material. And I realized that a lot of the things that I was talking about actually had applicability to more of the country than just the Eastern Cape. And so it seemed to make sense to try and reflect upon these issues much more widely than I had done before that particular period of time. You know, there are some other interesting things I think that led me into trying to think about South Africa as an entity, one of which is that it makes sense to think about South Africa rather than just the Eastern Cape for a variety of reasons. Another is that there, I mean, over the last 20 years, a number of really influential studies have come out of KwaZulu-Natal, for instance, looking at the role of marriage, the role of love. A couple of years ago, there were some really, I think, really excellent pieces on marriage through Anthropology Southern Africa. And so the kind of solid color quilt that I started out with, I kept adding patches to it. Oh God, that's a terrible metaphor, sorry. And so I think that, you know, one could swing either way. I could make the argument for the fact that actually a lot of what I'm writing about is specific to the Eastern Cape, but then because I've done the research, I could also start to explain to you where the similarities lie across the country, also where some of the differences lie. Which is interesting, which is, you know, certainly the project about female friends has to draw much more on Sotho and Tswana speakers for a variety of reasons that may be obvious to some of the people in the audience tonight. So that, I think, is the big question. Who out there is most challenged? Well, I was fortunate enough many years ago to be part of a sort of a number of mission-based research groups, and I really got, they were very stimulating, but they were always about male converts, and I'm writing back to some of that literature, and I'm writing back to what I think is a bunch of rather lazy historical work that, which has come to the conclusion that Christianity is really a male thing because all the sources out there are so obviously male. So there is a big source-driven propensity in the Southern African literature on Christianity to write about male Christians because of the way in which literacy unfolded in many of the mission schools, which were, you know, much more for men than they were for women. And that's a conversation that I could, you know, we could have a side conversation at some point about boarding schools. Yeah, when I was working with what I was doing, I mean, there were also a range of questions that I wanted to sort of keep on the periphery of what I was doing. One of which is that families don't always have to be kin-based, although they largely are, according to the evidence in South Africa. Not all kin-based families are necessarily happy families, but people go to great lengths to try and protect what in contemporary language might be referred to as found families. And I think that there needs to be a way out of the, I mean, you know, I'm guilty of it myself. I've written about a largely heterosexual culture, but there needs to be a way to kind of challenge some of the assumptions of kind of heterosexual culture, which focus on bonds created between men and women, and which focus on heterosexuality, but that doesn't mean that that's, you know, the extent of what is happening out there. Let me leave it there for the moment. I'll see if I can address some of your questions, other questions as we go along.
Thanks. Yeah, others might pick up on them too. Okay, Nafisa.
I'm just gonna, there you go. I'm just gonna start the video so people know I'm not Stephen. I don't know, maybe we sound oddly familiar. Similar, sorry. Hello, Natasha. No doubt I could just walk past your office at some point and we can have a conversation, but then all these nice people wouldn't get to be involved. So, you know, we can have some fun online too. I of course have read, very many bits of this manuscript at various different stages. So please do forgive me if I sound like a batty old lady who doesn't seem to remember what happened when and what ended up in the book and what didn't. But I was actually really kind of not provoked. I don't even know what the word is, but Wendy posed some interesting questions that I thought were kind of useful and could open up things a lot more in very interesting ways. So, well, one of the things I want to talk about is the Natal Eastern Cape divide, and I understand the practicality of that and all of that, but we also know that the Eastern Cape, basically harbors liberal magistrates who don't have Shepstone looking over them for the longest time, and in Natal it's a different kind of autocracy, and so liberalism dies there a lot earlier. So there is that sort of thing, but I'm wondering if that's not how you want to approach it. I mean, there are two other things. One is that lots of people, some of them on this chat, Norman Edrington is ridiculously precise about the number of Amakoa in Natal by the turn of the 20th century, because they become in the end, I think, a really almost extinct species. So part of the point is that the fear of Ethiopianism, and the first thing in response to that the state does is to take away the ability of African priests to solemnize marriage. So my interest in this is that why do people marry in different traditions and in different ways? And I say this as someone who, funnily enough, has grown up in a family who sort of, I imagine, morally live under the last bit of law that the South African state has yet to incorporate into, I don't know, things that make sense. And that is that, I had a customary marriage under Muslim law, which, is not a civil marriage. And then, I got married 5 years later to the same person. By civil marriage in, according to the laws of Washtenaw County. And so my thing is that, this isn't a particular to Christians, because, I mean, I suppose I'm not undermining the fact that Christianity is an incredibly important part of what you're talking about. But what I want to say is that the legal considerations in terms of, say, solemnizing marriage and other things, which are drivers of, they're drivers of supposedly intentionality, because it's something really difficult to read into historical sources, right? I mean, I know you know this. We've had many conversations about this. And the other thing is that those legal sources kind of, I think, help to sort of sort out a few methodological issues, right? I mean, I'm trying to think about, for example, the traditional African churches are killed very soon. I mean, are the ones who survive, and then, the mainline churches die very soon afterwards. The kind of 86% that you cited at the beginning of your presentation is Pentecostal, and, we all want to throw our hands up at that. The vast majority are. I tell you that the sort of 90% in my third year class on gender and sexuality claim to be Pentecostal. So, I think that's something we have to deal with, and the idea that morality might come from different places, because I got married according to customary rights, because my parents want me to do that, and my husband's parents wanted something, and apparently we were not allowed to have sex before marriage, so we did it for them. So I'm saying that there are these different drivers, and I suppose not to go on rambling too long, but the idea, I suppose, is how do you know why people get married or when? I think that there are a whole different set of ideas about this. When you talked about the new project on female sociality, I was kind of taken, because I think that project is a lot more methodologically similar to what you've just done. If we're willing to concede the methodological problems of doing this amazing project that you've been doing for many years and scratching your head about, and honestly, if you're having difficulty with this, and I imagine there are very many lesser minds who are. So I think that the source base for studying female sociality Okay, I'm going to shut up, Shireen, and give me 1 second. The source base, in the end, I think, for studying, say, female sociality, and especially in the places and amongst the people you want to, I think is really quite similar in the end to, white weddings or customary marriage. And I say this as someone who writes about customary marriage, has had one, and why I don't write about white weddings, but I've had one of those too. I did not get married in a white dress. It was midnight blue, closest thing to black I could get. But I do want to pose one thing, and my general enthusiasm for your project is undimmed, as always, and for your second project and every project you will ever write. I do have one question, and this question is because it's very late, almost 9 p.m., and I believe one more bottle of wine than we were willing to admit. So, the idea that Christianity is framed around men-male questions, I find puzzling. I mean, you're a gender historian. When you ask people why not gender, well, you're just asking them. My problem with that sort of configuration is that we always have to read with the grain, not against the grain, with the grain. Those male questions, and I hate to say it, but rest in peace, the soul of Jeff Guy and other structural Marxists. But the point is, they did make a useful point, which was that, the hot tax is one way in which men happen to be taxed directly and women indirectly. And it's our job to read the indirect stuff. So Christianity really might be, the sources might be about male questions, but gender is about relationality. So I'll leave you with that last drunken one, but I love you so much and I will see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nafisa. Sorry to get you going. Tash, I'm going to get Paul next. Go for it, Paul.
Okay, sorry. Let me lower my hand. So let me first of all say thank you. I'm privileged to be here. And Natasha, your book is fascinating and rich. And just congratulations on writing it. I guess my approach, you may know, is somewhat different. I first wrote about how political considerations can lead to an identity of Christian in Botswana, but also I think that what I'm wondering about is the friendship that you're going to be working on, the role of churches in integrating people who may actually be strangers and forming lateral connections with them. So this is going to be a question, but I'll just say that my view is that would fill this out for me more is an understanding of the kind of church practice that Kiernan talked about in church, where women are able to control the discourse in a certain way, not just the other kinds of things outside of church, which you deal with wonderfully, Debbie Gateskill and many others have, but actually sort of negotiating authority in that performance, especially because in my own research, not for the first book, but for the second, I found that deacons' meetings in the early 20th century were awfully concerned about reining in deviant practices and challenging young men who were seducing girls and finding pregnancies and all sorts of other things were the sort of meticulous issues. So I see this as sort of theater for elaborating and understanding a new kind of morality, and not maybe the Eastern Cape is not the only way to look at this, because on the Highveld and among Setswana speakers, I think as I think one can show, there's also sort of politics and social movements that are infiltrated by Christianity. Many seem like churches that are bringing people together to challenge their circumstance in a more kind of perhaps more aggressive way. So I guess to make this a question again, can you reflect on the way that friendships are established and sort of change the landscape through the practices that you're talking about? And I'll mute myself.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. Do you want to take these two, or shall we take, Deborah Gateskill's been nodding and shaking her head and very animatedly listening, and I'm keen to bring her into the conversation, given that this is your turf, Debbie. Unmute yourself, please.
I'm trying to do that, yeah. I don't quite know where to begin because, like Wendy, I've got lots of ways in and thoughts on. one of the things that struck me, I've very hastily read about half the book with great interest. When Adrian Hastings wrote about women and Christianity, one of the things he emphasized was that Christianity was a liberation to women because of the choice of marriage partners that it made possible and sort of validated. And I was just struck that I'm not quite sure whether the material you've seen has enabled you to get at that side of things from women's point of view. I mean, we have those very powerful letters where Dorothy ends up pregnant and is trying to argue her way to getting Selborne to marry her. But I just wondered if you had any reflections on that sort of issue about what Christianity, I mean, it's sort of a more basic issue that people were talking about 20 years ago. What does Christianity offer to women in this, I mean, not in everything, but in your particular thing that you're concerned with, in the sphere of personal, intimate relations? I mean, you make it clear that there is this challenge about the secrecy, and that's where the boarding schools that Wendy was interested in come in, that there is a different way things operate, where you don't have the sort of peer group supervising courtship, and there is this secret courtship of letters and relationships in the boarding school. But did you get much sense of this point that Hastings makes of the freedom to choose your own marriage partner and not be quite so manipulated by parents and young men? And yet, I mean, your book shows young men pressuring girls. So, you know, maybe Hastings overstates women's freedom. Right. That's going in about 3 directions, but that's an initial thought.
Natasha.
Thanks. Thanks also, Nafisa, and we might need to take some of that conversation offline. Debbie and Paul, and I saw Jackie nodding as well there. So just on the point about Hastings, Debbie, I think that one of my answers would be, I mean, I would need to think about it more carefully. I agree entirely, but I'm wondering about periodization. And when some of these things come into existence more. And that also, in a sense, relates to some of what Nafisa was saying, and even Paul was saying, which is, you know, I find that I need to sort of refer to the post-1950 period when answering some of the questions I get asked, because there really is this dramatic shift where membership, certainly from the 1960s onwards, people who are in formerly mainline churches, the historic mission churches, are moving across to the Pentecostal churches, or in South Africa, or Botswana or Zimbabwe, to the ZCC and its various affiliated churches. So it is really a fairly different kettle of fish. So one way to answer your question, Debbie, and I'll come back to you, Paul, is to say I desperately wanted to find happy women in marriages. It was just incredibly difficult. And I don't think that's because they don't exist. I think that, funnily enough, those really, really dry court records that I referred to in the last chapter show extremely affectionate relationships, some of which work because people have chosen their own partners. Some of them may be partners chosen for them by their parents. I mean, there's the young woman who keeps running away from the husband her parents have chosen for her and going back to someone. And I think she's the case where I say, well, here's an interesting case of what's effectively polyandry, because according to the court records, she's actually married to 2 different people at the same time, which it's technically actually not possible, but according to different courts in South Africa, the two marriages existed simultaneously. So I think it's the choice of marriage partner probably becomes something over which women have something again. No, sorry. Women begin to have more control over choice of marriage partner over the course of the 20th century, but at the same time, marriage rates are declining. So choice of lover might be a better descriptor. And I do wonder sometimes, I mean, Adrian Hastings doesn't really talk about what people are doing outside of their marriages. So that's the one part. And then, so I have to make a confession here. My current project is a history of reproductive health across sub-Saharan Africa. I am going to, I think I want to think about the issue about female friendships at some later point. But it's a kind of side project because lots of people were asking me about mother-in-laws this year over the course of talking about my work, one of which was virtually in the Eastern Cape, Wendy. And I got some really good feedback from there. So that is not my main preoccupation, but I would agree with Paul and Nafisa that probably some of those questions can be answered in the same way. Paul, I think that, I mean, I think I agree with you more than you think I agree with you, if that makes any sense in what you've written previously. Certainly about the kinds of authority conveyed in church. Now, one of the interesting things that you don't get out of church records, for instance, is you don't get the gender composition of congregation attendance. It's really, really difficult. The people who tend to describe going to church services don't say that largely the church is probably filled with women, which is probably the case through much of the 20th century, and even today is largely the case. So there's a kind of I don't want to use that word institutional life of the church, but the body of the chosen are probably largely female, but it's a kind of separation of spaces that is odd to look at, and yet you look at authority figures and you see that that by far and away the majority of authority figures in all South African churches are male, and in the independent churches, the Pentecostalist churches, especially in the what we would have formerly called the Ethiopianist churches, the African initiated churches, women very, very seldom make it up into what would be considered the formal clergy. So those spaces of authority are certainly there, but I think that they do need to be inflected. And this is where I'm going to kind of use that age-old excuse, which is that the publishers made me chop out almost the equivalent of a whole chapter. It's not really their fault. Where I spent more time actually talking about church-going rituals and church practices. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackie.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, you can hear me. Thank you. And Natasha, thank you so much. And I really regret to say I don't have the book yet, but I've read other things by you, and I've read a bit of the book online. And I really enjoyed your presentation. I think you're onto some very interesting things. First of all, I just wonder if we can make an analogy between what you're talking, like polyandrous motherhood, which is, to use Jane Geyer's term, about women who have partners, have children with different partners over the years. I wonder if there's something polyandrous or polygynous about church affiliation. I mean, people can have multiple church affiliations. They change a lot. Maybe, I mean, you seem to present it as perhaps slightly more stable than I've observed it, which is mostly in Botswana. So the South African case might have a slightly different inflection, but people are testing out different churches often, and shifting from one to another for a variety of reasons that not talk about right now. The other thing I found very interesting is this notion of female friendship. And I think female relations, relations between women are very, very important and have been so utterly neglected. This is something that both Mark Hunter and I have brought up in our work, at least for the Anthropology of Southern Africa issue on marriage. One of the things women often have very good relations with their families, with their natal families, their sisters, their mothers, their classificatory sisters and cousins, or all the different terms you might want to use, and they are ripped away from those to some extent upon marriage, which is very patriarchal. And so on the one hand, you have perhaps women less reluctant to marry because they don't want to sever the relations with their kin, which are more like friendship relations. And two, which I think is very important, is that the early, and still to some extent, but particularly the early researchers, whether they be historians, anthropologists, or sociologists, neglected women except as wives. And so you don't get a good sense of the social life and interactions and affective relations amongst women with each other, and also with other people with whom they live, because they're wives. They're exchanged for Lobolo or some form of bride wealth, Bahati or whatever. They provide children for their husband's lineage. They're not really seen as or understood, and I'm exaggerating, I'm essentializing here, but generally they're not understood as wholesome individuals in the way men are. Okay, thank you. This has been.
Can I
Thanks,
add
Jackie.
something to that, Tash? I've been reading Oyeronke Oyewumi's work on theorizing gender, and her central point is that seniority is a way of escaping gender. Well, that seniority matters, gender doesn't. And I wonder if you could, I just want to tack that onto Jackie's point and the earlier discussion about power and authority, and whether, what is the role of the women who may not have formal positions in the church leadership, but I would imagine have significant regulatory power socially over younger women. So I just want to tack that on, if possible.
So I'm probably I should probably kind of stand up and confess that I tend to believe that we vastly underestimate the power of generation in we just say African history, and that those generational relationships are really critical. And if we are trying to look for other kinds of relationships, more lateral relationships, we often miss the importance of generational relationships. There's been some really interesting work recently, and more on the historical side, but also getting into the anthropology on age grades. And age grades are not typically written about in South African history. It's more a part of the older anthropology. Eileen Kricher did some of this work years and years ago, and it comes up in places. So we do need to pay more attention to generation. There has been a really interesting piece, actually, a recent PhD out of the Eastern Cape that looks at Xhosa women of authority. Now, we know quite a lot at the moment about Zulu women of authority, and how they negotiated their positions. And someone like Princess Constance Magogo is probably a really good example of this. The mother of the late, not lamented, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and the kinds of roles that she played, and how she contracted a marriage of convenience rather than a marriage of love in order to enhance lineage politics. So yes, those things are absolutely and fundamentally important. And I mean, okay, so I was hoping for a moment at which I could sort of maybe quote from one of my favorite books, and Sunyati, if any of you know her work, writes lovely stuff. She's just won a big prize for her most recent work, which I haven't read, but it's called The Polygamist, and it's about a relationship with a polygamist by all of the different wives. And one of the things that the oldest wife does is that after 17 years of marriage, although her husband's left her and he's already taken another wife, she has she sends out an invitation. Joyce and Jonasi Gomorrah cordially invite to celebrate their 17th wedding anniversary. It's been 17 fabulous years. Come celebrate with us. And the book is really, it's told from the perspective of the 4 different wives. And it really brings out some of the tensions that can exist between women based on seniority. And one of the things is that when you're missing the sources, often you do have to go to the literature to try and the fiction to try and speculate about what might have happened. What I wanted to say about the Xhosa women of authority is that the general thinking is that often women who are through menopause then are allowed to become honorary men. And I use that in inverted commas because they're no longer fertile. But some of the more recent work has shown that, in fact, women who aren't through menopause are becoming and assuming positions of leadership, and people understand them to be women. I mean, they're not necessarily thick on the historical ground, but they are there. And I think that, again, we haven't necessarily looked for them in the past. Jackie, I completely agree about what I call kind of timeshare Christianity, which is when you go on holiday, you have one particular church. When you're at home, you have another church. If you get married and you're a woman, you have to take your husband's church. So there is quite a lot of very strategic, but strategic not just for instrumental reasons, strategic, I think, also for reasons of faith and access to resources. That means that people are spreading their faith lives, their Christian-based faith lives, across a number of different institutions. And that's why it's really important for us to move away from denominational histories, because the denominational histories try and lure us into the idea that people are lifelong members of one or another particular church. So I agree with you completely.
There was a hand up. Oluwatobi Alabi, you had your hand up. Do you want to join the conversation?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for the book. I've not had the time to read. I just jumped in, and I wanted to comment on something about power and how women navigate sometimes very complex spaces. I am currently writing a book. I did my doctoral thesis on women's use of traditional aphrodisiacs in Nigeria, especially contemporarily, and how it shapes power relations within intimate relationships. And so my new book is really speaking to this point that across various systems, across history, across time, women, and attention has not been given to this in literature, navigate the spaces through various means. Some of them unconventional, some of them subtle, and some of them very uncommon and quite unusual. So I was specifically looking at how the use of traditional aphrodisiacs, the use of sexual intimacy, sexual relationship for these women, Kayamata specifically in Nigeria, transcends sexual stimulation and enhancement and fits into issues of power, issues of recognition within not just marriages, but even within the politics of polygamous relationship, intimate relationships, relationships between women and in-laws. So I feel like as we think through some of the work that we do within the spaces, it's important to pay attention to the nuances and the uncommon and very often unusual ways in which power dominance is often challenged within spaces. I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for your book and the discussion.
I'm going to take Tracy Muradzikwa and Vinny Mazzio, and I think that'll be the total of questions, unfortunately. So Tracy, go ahead.
Thank you, Natasha, for an interesting book. I just want to add on to what Oluwatobi was saying. I'm a PhD student and I'm working on female traditional leaders in Zimbabwe, how they've managed to legitimize their authority, the different strategies that they've used to legitimize their authority. And it's quite interesting that what Oluwatobi was saying is exactly what I'm working on. And even what Natasha was presenting when she spoke about the Princess Magogo and the Xhosa traditional leaders, it's quite resonating in so many ways with my work. So thank you so much for quite an interesting book, and I hope to enjoy reading it when I get hold of it.
Thank you, Tracy. Vinny.
Hi, Natasha, thank you so much for this book and for your work more broadly put. My question is very much related, I'll turn on my camera actually. My question is very much related to both your book, the discussion, and the fact that you've stated that you're interested in women's reproductive health across the African continent. I wasn't going to ask you this question, but I thought it was fitting given the fact that you had brought it into today's conversation. So I wanted to start by saying I find it interesting that you think about declining marriage rates and the claim that it's about a depiction of the failure of intimacy within the Black family or Christianity as a kind of failure of historiography, and that you talk about it as a form of maintaining love or different kinds of effective relationships in very difficult conditions or contexts, specifically in relation to migrant labor. And I wanted to ask you, drawing heavily on my own dissertation work right now, about the placement, if at all, the placement of health in either marriage or narrating these kinds of discussions that are happening in your own work. And I'll give you an example. It might seem far-fetched or far from your own work, but in the 1960s and 70s, cervical cancer is being depicted as the problem of declining marriage rates. It's depicted as the failure of intimacy within the Black family. It's depicted within, for instance, the Sunday Times and the Rand as the failure of Christianity to materialize well in areas like Johannesburg. And I'm wondering if health in any way, shape, or form, even broadly put, configures in your work at all, maybe not so much in the book, but maybe in terms of what you've seen that hasn't made it into the book. I'm really curious because even when we talk about female friendship, for me, cervical cancer is a fight around which women of different generations who would normally be considered strangers are able to develop relationships of care and obligations of care in order to support one another, not through curative care, but through kind of living with this chronic disease. So is there any way that you can maybe touch upon health in relation to your work within the book, or what was left out of the book?
Natasha, when you reply to this, you might also want to just wrap everything up because our next class begins soon and people just drift away.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank Oluwatobi and Tracy for their comments. I think that those sound like really interesting pieces of research, an interesting book, an interesting study. Tracy, I've just read a really interesting PhD on basically witches in Zimbabwe and the way in which women get stigmatized through various proverbs. So I'm really interested in those kinds of aspects as well. And I think that there are aphrodisiacs. That's a fascinating topic. I know someone else, I spoke to someone else, another Nigerian. Nigeria is not one place. There are many different parts of Nigeria, who's interested in male infertility and subfertility. And I imagine those two topics go quite hand in hand. Vinny, thanks very much. So Yes, there's a lot of health that I came across. It's mostly mother and child health. So a lot of the principal hospitals in South Africa in the early 20th century are mission hospitals. So many of the people who are mission doctors are also writing as missionaries, and they bring the work at the hospitals into what they're writing about. And it's one of the things, for instance, is that most of the hospitals across Southern Africa, of which there were not a large number, would have opened with daily prayer, for instance. So prayer was wound into the rituals of a hospital life. So there are lots of, most of the stuff that I've read is about obstetrical cases, difficult deliveries. I have read more than I ever want to read about vaginal fistulas and the tragedy of vaginal fistulas. I don't recall reading about, I mean, there was that big project in Ethiopia in the 80s and 90s where a foreign couple set up a hospital to treat, or was it Somalia? But I don't recall reading anything about cervical cancer. But the body of the woman, so, one of the things that I didn't speak about today are the bodies of the people involved in the kinds of study that I'm talking about. But people were, there's often a real corporeality to the way that people talk about their religious practice, for instance. The kinds of rituals, and Debbie would know much more about this than I do. The rituals that women went through when they were doing all-night prayers, for instance. There are all sorts of somatic practices that are linked to initiation, for instance. And the health stuff sort of is on the side, but I'm not recollecting anything particularly about cancer at the moment. But people do have an ongoing and enduring relationship with ideas of health, and it's almost always a mediation between do I go to a Western doctor or do I go to a traditional healer? And most of my students in Johannesburg in 2023 are negotiating between regular doctors and traditional healers. Again, it's a bit like the religion question that Jackie was talking about. People are keeping their options open, which is a wonderfully creative way, I think, of approaching certain kinds of issues, even if they are tragic issues relating to permanent issues of ill health. Thank you.
I just want to say, Tash, on that question of health and prayer and so on, that it's still the practice in South African hospitals for the nurses to begin their shift with singing Christian hymns and songs. And my very, very Muslim mother, who was in hospital, and I went to see her and I said, oh my God, I don't know how you can put up with this. And she was really cross with me because she felt that it was comforting even for her as a Muslim. There was something not about the actual God that was being prayed to, but the idea of calling on each other to care for each other. That's how it was experienced. And I sort of changed my mind about that. And so it kind of goes to your point about the multiple meanings of religious practices beyond
They'd get prosecuted
worship.
in Britain. They'd get
I know they would,
prosecuted today in Britain if they did that.
Yeah, every single the South African School Act prohibits the reading of prayers. That was a question that I think Paul had earlier about, is South Africa sort of secular or not? Yeah. And ostensibly it is, but really it's not. That's the quick answer. So yeah, thank you everyone for these, for listening so attentively, and it's a real pleasure after the book has been released to have a bit of time to reflect on it, to bounce off questions people have given me. I'm going to use the questions that you've given me, my time tonight, to think further through some of these issues. It's really, really helpful. And, it's really great to be part of such an excellent academic community. thank you all. Thank you to Carlton, thank you, Shireen, and thank you to those of you who helped put together the seminar.
And thank you so much, Wendy, too, for your really lovely and thoughtful comments. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's been such a great semester full of wonderful books, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And we'll convene again in September next year. So take care, look after yourselves, be safe. And I'm not religious, I can't say Godspeed, but happy holidays. And take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.